Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another Spark of Genius Flesh and Blood production. And we have one of our, dare I say, one of our favorite guests of the channel here. We have Miss Elly Bird from Team Stroopwafel here. And this is, I'm joined with my co-creator, co-commentator, co-caster, co-compatriot, Rob on the bottom there, of course. And this is, you might have seen an article about this. You might have seen this deck on Fab TCG. You might have seen this deck in passing in Boltyn chat or something. But we brought Elly on to explain how she was able to X-0 the PQ. Well, I say the PQ.
Say PQ because you were the TO.
I was the judge. I even judged it.
Judge.
And so I got to see a couple of these games, and so I got to see Boltyn go burr. So we brought Elly on to demonstrate how this deck goes burr. And without further ado, I'm gonna skip the why Boltyn because I
would love to talk about why Boltyn.
That'll be a separate episode, maybe.
I think at this point, I think the only things to say is this was a very localized meta. I think this was like quite specialized over what someone might come in like a 40-50 man PQ,
right?
Which I've seen in Europe. It's kind of funny. So as far as like this is a little bit more narrow as far as the PQ season, but Elly will kind of talk about any matchups that she didn't see or something like that that are like meta that might be in your meta that will also be kind of talked about a little bit. It's not going to just be like a tournament report where it's like this is what I saw, this is how I did, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
And to that end, let's talk a little bit about Boltyn here. So let's start with the
equipment suite, maybe
equipment suite at the top. So we'll just go main and side. So on the main here we see the versus. This is a Raiden build, but there are also different like switchblade builds and stuff like that. But you have Raiden in the main. You have Warband, you have Snaps, Tunic, and Iron Song. Anything you want to talk about specifically on the equipment suite?
Nothing too incredibly like particular to talk about. Yeah, it's pretty standard gear
for now.
Yeah, we can move to the sideboard.
Yeah. What pertains to the other equipment in the sideboard?
Yeah, let's look at that. Got a lot of equipment actually.
Yeah,
so we've got so much equipment. Wow. I registered so much equipment that on my deck list sheet I had to add another like line for the 13th piece of equipment because there's only 12 slots on the sheet.
Oh yeah. That's pretty good.
Yeah, so we have I guess start us off with just the pieces, and you can talk about the weapons strategy you have when you're bringing these pieces in, kind of how good they played out, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the two I think like less, kind of off the beaten path pieces of equipment that are in the deck here are Balance of Justice and Soulbond Resolve. I went back and forth for a pretty long time about Balance of Justice and Boltyn, just because Warband it's worth so much. I think not stumbling into certain heroes is just worth a lot. But I really wanted a bit more of an edge in the Brute matchup, especially just like playing a bunch of games with Yuki, and it was just like the Kayo matchup was way too 50-50 for me to be comfortable like trying to spike a PQ on Boltyn, and so I was like, I want a bit of an edge. So I wanted more armor. That was part of Soulbond's job. Soulbond is there as well to just like Bodge, Soulbond, Ironsong versus I can blank a CNC without giving you cards if I really want to, which feels pretty important to be able to do in the present meta. Balance of Justice is also particularly strong against the Brutes because a lot of it is like there's kind of this play back and forth that happens with that card in that matchup as they'll Blood Rush. You will like block with Balance and crack it to like get 2 life and then draw a card out of it, and then like you might block with the card, but a lot of the time you're just going to try and come back and hit them with 6 cards to outdo their Blood Rush turn, which is going to prompt them to give you their Scowling Flesh bag. So you kind of counterspell each other's hats a little bit.
Right.
And then you just kind of get 2 block out of it. And you also put them in a position where if they've already used the hat by the time you bodge, or they don't use it, you can end up hurting them like quite bad.
Sure.
Which I think happened in the first game I played against the same Rhinar I met in finals in Swiss. Was he blood rushed, I like cracked Balance of Justice, and he had already given me Fleshbag on a prior turn where I played via the Vanguard, and it was just like worth so incredibly much because the extra card was I think it was just like an over 4, but it was like on a turn where I just needed to keep hitting him. And he couldn't take that card away from me, and just having 6 cards to hit him with was just like kind of smothering.
Nice.
Yep.
And at the worst case, you get an extra card to block with on a blood rush turn if you really have to.
Sure.
The minimum is that it blocks for 5.
Yeah.
And I think that's like the big piece that a lot of decks that are running balance don't really get to take advantage of, like Boltyn does. Is like you get the card, but you don't have to just block with your shit because you can actually send a lot more damage back at them, which I think Boltyn specifically does a very good job at doing exactly that. And so it's even more flexible in Boltyn. So I quite like the pick.
It's also really good at stocking your hand up to charge.
It could be worth a lot of extra damage on V, like a big V turn. Could be like 3+ damage on V. It's or just like pure damage depending on what you're able to draw. So it's quite good. The other pieces of armor. So I think it seems like it's mainly when you're bringing in when you're dual wielding, essentially with Centaurus, Saber, and Hotstray. So talk about like the dual wield package, I guess.
Yeah, the dual wield package kind of has like 2 modes a little bit, and that there are matchups that I try to combo in the first cycle of the game, where I will take Snapdragon Scalers with Courage and Gallantry to just like try to find 2 combo pieces, and then just go like, okay, charge, snaps, traditional Boltyn combo, I'm gonna hit you. And then you actually play the Refraction Bolters to have 6 armor with a kind of slightly different version of the combo where you are actually pitch stacking into Oath of Steel Triple Lumina to kind of dunk on some of these dirtlier decks. Like Kassai and stuff. Something this is like kind of an approach you'll take to that matchup is that like a lot of Kassai decks will struggle to actually get 40 damage over if you're just willing to drop your whole hand in front of whatever they're doing, because you're just stacking like a really sick 5-card hand at the bottom of your deck. And so you'll like keep you take bolters so that you can have 6 armor. If they try to like hold on to a CNC for when you get to that pitch stacked hand, you can just go like, it's just really cool that you sat on that CNC and tried to play around what I'm doing, but unfortunately for you, I have 6 armor and none of your choices matter, and now I'm going to hit you with 68 damage right upside the head.
Yeah.
And then otherwise you just play the traditional like first cycle like snaps combo, etc.
Makes sense. So that's kind of the real difference between that. You have the bolters or the snaps as far as your combo pieces there. Okay. That makes sense. So let's talk a bit about the main deck, scrolling back up here.
Yes.
There are some more. I mean, I'm not really gonna be talking about like what did you run Lumina? We're gonna talk about some of the other more interesting cards, like Red Resounding Courage and stuff like that. So are there, I mean, other than the one I literally mentioned, what are the kind of cards that you think are maybe in your list that you wouldn't see in the I don't know what a typical Boltyn list looks like nowadays, to be honest with you. But maybe the ones that
after overexposure to my deck lists.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I've played it, I've seen it, I understand your type of Boltyn, but like as far as what you think might be on the more standard side that kind of everyone agrees upon versus the ones that maybe you have a different take on, or they do very well in specific matchups and that's why you brought them in, that kind of thing.
I think some of the less popular cards in the main board are... I'll just start with Battlefield Blitz. It's the first card we see here. I think this card kind of fell out of favor in a lot of Boltyn decks for a very long time, just for, like... I think one of the ways Boltyn was winning games for quite some time was, A, he was, like, a dedicated Sabres combo deck for quite some time, and so you didn't really care to be running these, like, cards that convert largely, like, exclusively aggressively. And then... I think the game was just quite fast after that when he started to like see a little bit of success a little later on. So the card didn't see play. Like something that was really popular for a while was just this like 9 Valiant Thrust deck.
Right.
Not exactly my speed, but I see why the deck existed, and they were kind of like playing for just like to be overrated all the time. But I think this card is just like very, very, very flexible and very, very efficient. 1 for 5 is like always a good rate. The card blocks 3 if you need it to, and even conditionally having Go again, it just often ends up being one of the cards in the best cards of one of the cards in the deck, one of the best cards in the deck.
Yeah, it also helps when you keep those 4 or 5 card hands. Even if you get the 6 cards, it's actually a very good card to put in between your combos because it just does a lot of damage, and like you said, I just Go again. So a big hand would actually make this card quite good.
Yeah, going 3 or 4 chain links wide while still being soul positive often just completely outpaces like the 2 damage you might get off of having a Valiant Thrust in the same spot. Obviously, you play both,
right.
But I think it kind of just feels like more Valiant Thrusts.
That makes sense. I see you have the one of cheeky Bolt of Courage there. Ask you about that one of yellow Bolt of Courage.
Oh, there it is.
So the one yellow Bolt of Courage was kind of like me going back and forth on trying to balance my charger count. There's a point in time where I was on 27, which was like no Express Lightnings, 3 yellow Bolt of Courage, and then I had something else in the slot that eventually became like Resounding Courage and stuff. And that felt a little too low. I felt like I was probably bricking like once per game, which isn't really where you want your A plus B style deck to be.
Yeah.
And then I kind of went up to 30, and then that had like a different problem of being like, well, I've only gone up 1 playset, but now my hands are just terrible way more often. So I ended up kind of waffling back and forth on like a 2-1 split of like maybe it's 28 chargers or maybe it's 29 chargers. And then I ended up settling on 28 as like a little bit of a numbers hedge, and Bolt of Courage was kind of just like the worst. Yellow Bolt specifically was kind of just the worst one, so it ended up getting trimmed.
Right.
At least it's yellow when you charge it.
Yeah.
It's another yellow.
That's true.
With the cards that care, right? When charging a yellow do this, it's not. Could be worse. Okay, so it's
would be.
It's mainly charge equity, essentially, just getting to your 28th, which is what you determined for this event to be like the most ideal as far as ratios go. So that makes sense.
Yeah.
This Resounding Courage here, right in the right there.
Yeah.
So Dust Till Dawn. I know people forget about the set a little bit because it's when it came out, it was very polarizing and very specific and kind of useless in many ways. But now it's coming out of the woodwork. So one of the cards from Dust Till Dawn, Resounding Courage. Why 2 Resoundings?
This card, I run 2 of them because I think otherwise the deck's mana might be stretched a little too thin between like you have like Take Flights, you have the Battlefield Blitzes, you have the Valiant. Yeah, as far as like your 1 cost, kind of like the deck tries to play off of a lot of free resources through cards like Goblet of Blood Run Wine, Slap Happy, Tunic. And so I didn't want to run 3 because I felt like it might be a little bricky. You might draw. Same problem as like having too many chargers. Having too many non-chargers is like you'll kind of draw these non-functional hands. You never want to draw 2 of this card at the same time. But this card is pretty bonkers. It was like a lot better than I thought it was going to be throughout that tournament. It was a little bit of a like, I have this tendency towards like where, because deck building is how I tend to solve a lot of problems in this game, something that gives me a lot of confidence before a tournament that I really want to do well at is to kind of shift some cards around in my deck. And this card was I think I put this in the deck at like 2 a.m. prior to the event, and then like fell asleep, and then I woke up and I was just like drawing Resounding Courage, and I was like, wow, this is sick! Who put this in here?
Nice.
And just like slamming it on the table. But it's just very, very, very good on rate. It's like probably the singular most efficient attack reaction in all of Fab. It's 1 for 4 value across 2 chain links, and it blocks 3 if you're forced to block with it. It's a pretty crazy card.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a little narrow in that it only hits light warrior attacks.
Oh, true. Yeah.
Sure.
But the deck has kind of also been tweaked in a way where that's not as much of a problem, i.e. there's no like snatches or anything in the deck anymore.
Yeah,
Right,
it's
right.
just, you got like Cataclysm, and that's pretty much it. As far as like
Yeah,
your
it's
Illuminate.
like, yeah, that's true. In your main, I mean, in your main board. But
Yeah,
yeah, Illuminate and stuff like that. But it makes sense. I also really liked, when I saw it, I really actually liked the defensive value more than anything. Because the fact
Yeah.
is, you're getting a lot of these assassins coming out of nowhere, and some cards that even against in the mirror and stuff like that, it's not an attack action. So it's actually got like some pretty solid defensive value because attack reaction is just not something that people really consider very heavily on. Like, oh, I need to target this for blocks. I need to make sure.
Yeah, they rarely have 3 block. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. They rarely have 3 block, and you could just keep them on the offense anyways. So slap happy.
Slap happy.
What a great card. Exactly. Why 2 slap happy? Question mark.
Why 2 is a great
name.
question. Why not
so
3?
I mean, it's a good card. I mean, like the vigor especially is like very good. The prevent 2 is like good against obviously arcane damage and such, but 2 in general gets over a bunch of stuff. But like the vigor is obviously one of the main reasons you're running this card, I assume.
Yeah, generating the vigor is incredibly powerful. Why 2 is actually a pretty good question. I kind of found myself going back and forth on 2 of this and 3 of Goblet, or 3 of this and 2 of Goblet. I'm still not really sure which I prefer. Because it's easier to like kind of keep going with tempo with Slap Happy. You can just like slam at an arsenal, they throw a C and C, you say, okay, cool, I'll block 2, get 1 mana, I don't really care. Goblet kind of takes a little bit more setup, but the agility is obviously also very high value.
Yes. Very, very good resource efficiency there, because you just save yourself a charge card. I think
you save yourself an entire like card and soul.
Yeah.
Which is something that you can expend later.
I guess it also does something if your opponent doesn't do anything. Like if you hit him really hard, at least you get it out of hand. Whereas Slap Happy's like dead in hand, dead in arsenal. It doesn't really do too much because it needs to prevent to create the vigor. It doesn't just make the vigor. Whereas Goblet will do what Goblet does every time, I guess, right?
Yeah, Goblet also has turns where it ends up being pretty flexible. It's pretty rare you want to pitch 3 in a given turn, but sometimes it lines up. Sometimes you go like Take Flight, Valiant Thrust, Iron Song versus, and that's not every turn, but sometimes having a blue is pretty good. I think 3 is roughly the exact number of blues I would want in a Boltyn deck.
Right.
So
yeah.
No, it makes sense. It's very low to the ground. Like most of your stuff costs 0 or 1. I mean, it totally makes sense. Goblet just being one of those cards just like sick in draft and just sick in CC, just like happenstance is just very, very interesting to me. But
it's got those beautiful alt arts, those extended arts are so sweet.
Extended. Oh yeah, I remember those. I got like a pile of those in the back. But other than that, I don't see anything crazy in the main board, unless there was something that you wanted to like mention the main board that I already asked you about.
Just the last point on Slap Happy was also, I think it's a very card efficient card. I think like both blocking 2 and then generating 1 mana is often kind of the job of 2 cards in Boltyn.
Okay.
And just like being able to do that on 1 card lets you function on smaller hands, which lets you keep more cards with which to charge, and it's kind of this compounding effect where you try to compress what your cards are doing.
Sure.
So that your turns are more efficient.
That's a very good point.
It allows you to go big and small, as they say. So it definitely makes sense here. Moving into the inventory, the sideboard, whatever you want to call it here.
Yeah.
We've got 1s, we've got 2s, we've got 3s.
Oh my.
Okay, so let's talk about actually how would you like to describe your sideboard? What would you like to talk about specifically here? I'm not gonna presume to know how this was designed here.
Because we've tried. I'm kidding.
I think that's been a lot of people's reaction to this list, and I think a lot of what I've had to say is I promise it's not as wacky as it looks. All of these cards
the 3 a.m.
Like a job.
The 3 a.m. decisions that were made here.
They're good cards, I promise. The Agile Windup, I'll just start left to right. The Agile Windup is pretty much just for Prism.
Okay.
This is not a card I would generally include in Boltyn. This card has a bit of a funny story behind it, which is that a local, Lucas, who plays Prism, said something to me like 3 days before the PQ, which is he was like, Elly, I've been practicing the Boltyn matchup. I have a plan for it now. And that, like, I was just kind of like, I went 3-2 at the last PQ. Please leave me alone. I'm going home and putting an extra 7 in my deck.
Oh my god.
I think in a wider meta, I probably wouldn't do this, but I knew I was going to see like at least 2 to 3 prisms at the event.
Right.
So I just wanted the extra hedge.
Yeah.
And I think short of Celestial Cataclysm, it's just easily the best popper in Boltyn. I think it's actually a very easy card to include if you want to target Prism. Because like if she doesn't end up throwing something at you, it's very easy to just like, I'm just gonna slam this in my graveyard, keep my deck velocity kinda churning, put an agility on the board, kinda let my next turn go soul positive if it couldn't already. So it looks a little wacky, but it has a purpose, and I actually think it's a decent card. Steel Hand.
3 of.
Yeah, this card's just kind of like a slam dunk in basically every Boltyn deck. It's pretty much only in the sideboard because it's not in the deck sometimes, which is kind of how I assess that sort of thing. Is it's like, if it's not in the main deck, that means in at least one matchup it's not there.
Right.
And it's not in the deck when I'm comboing, typically.
Okay.
Sure,
but otherwise it's always in.
So it's always in except for Kassai, I guess?
You also combo like Ninja, like Katsu.
Okay. Yeah.
Because it's like he can make you very sad if you have a hand where you just like don't want to block.
Yeah.
He'll just dishonor you and then you will lose the game. So I think you generally favor trying to combo him first cycle.
Right. Okay, so I guess you can kind of split out your sideboard as like aggro, combo 1, combo endgame. Kind of I'm just saying like when we eventually go to like the matchups, you could just talk about, oh, this is the aggro, you just do this. So just as far as any of the viewers, that's kind of like how it's being segmented here. But don't run this card if you're comboing essentially.
But it's otherwise just a completely crazy card. It's what if Lightning Press blocked and also didn't have to target a cheap card.
That's fair.
Which is real impressive.
Illuminate 2 of.
The slot used to be Snatch.
Okay.
I was kind of looking for like an efficient threat that would encourage my opponent to interact with me or just make them very sad if I slapped it down at the end of a relatively wide turn. And pretty much the big thing that made me choose this over Snatch is that right now I feel like with the way the deck's constructed, it's occasionally difficult to draw a random card and then go like, oh, sick, I can convert this. That's not like the most common thing in the deck, so I ended up settling on this both because it blocks 3 and because if they let it hit, it goes into Soul, which is often worth a card regardless. So it's kind of like a Snatch. It's a little bit like a Snatch.
And if Snatch doesn't have Go again, people don't care as much unless they have a card. Well, if you have a card in hand, it's, obviously it's fine, you'll draw 2 and then you're wasting the card, but at least this card has a permanent effect on the board that if it hits, it's like no matter if you have a card in hand, this is still going to be pretty good.
It's a little more consistently value than Snatches.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I
actually know why the Oath of Steel is. I know why it's here, but why don't you explain to everyone the one Oath of Steel?
Steel is part of the pitch stacking combo plan. It only comes into my deck in matchups where I want to pitch stack a triple Lumina combo, and you get to that turn and you go like, we Oath of Steel, triple Lumina, 7, 8, 9, 10, 7, 8, 9, 10. And that's like, what it's for is just setting up that really powerful end game turn. Otherwise, it's never in the deck.
Right.
Makes sense.
Got some sinks blows.
I kind of feel like this card doesn't need any introduction.
Fair, that's fair.
It is Sink Below.
Yeah.
I play 3 when comboing and 2 most of the rest of the time. I typically have a 4th defense reaction in the deck for comboing. But as I said, a couple 2 AM changes, so
right.
like a single Fate for Scene.
Gotcha.
The Fate for Scene. I know you were like playing around with Shunt a little bit, obviously. So there were probably some like different pieces depending on maybe meta dependent or just like more D-reacts and stuff like that.
I think Shunt largely left the deck because it's a little too clunky sometimes. It feels so bad to have that card when you don't have Tunic up or in a matchup where you're not playing Tunic.
Yeah. Honestly, I kind of hated it even with Tunic when I played the deck. It's
not a very compelling thing to want to spend a Tunic counter on.
Yeah.
It's like I have Take Flight. but I have to use this on Tunic, otherwise I'm just losing value. It's just
Otherwise, this card is gonna rot here for 3 more turns. Yeah. It definitely left the deck for myriad reasons.
Like, imagine being on rate defensively. Ugh. It's not where I want to be. It's not where I want to spend a sideboard slot. Okay. The third Celestial. What is that? Made like Prism and stuff like that?
It definitely comes in against Prism. This card will also come in against decks that are trying to play a longer game, and maybe part of their win condition is just running you out of threats in your deck.
Sure.
This card really stretches your offensive value. It lets you cash in Soul in the late game. And this card's very important into some of those fatiguier decks because you can set up like V of the Vanguard Celestial Cataclysm, which is often just way too much damage for any deck to keep up with.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Remembrance, and so we got the one on Remembrance, and then 2 Warmongers Diplomacy. So what's Remembrance? So Remembrance is, I guess, you're targeting Lumina, Boomina.
Yeah, Remembrance is a similar kind of thing with the fatigue decks and 2 decks like Victor and Uzuri. Is that part of your game plan in those matchups is to just like keep hitting them, because those decks just like lose the game by bleeding value to Boltyn's text box, and especially on Lumina Ascension turns. And a lot of those decks' win condition is, I've survived all 3 of your Lumina Ascensions, and you can kind of slap this card on the table and say, well, no, you haven't.
Only half of them.
Actually, I played a game against an Arachne at APQ this season where, bless his heart, he was talking as he contract banished my 3rd Lumina Ascension after I had played 2 off the top of my deck. He banished the last one, and he was like, oh, sick, I can, just a little bit of table talk. He was like, I can actually usually win this matchup if I can kind of steal one of Boltyn's Lumina Ascensions. And then I went to my turn, and it was like charge attack, Beacon of Victory, and then out of Arsenal I responded with Remembrance and shuffled back 2 Luminas. And he just said, I'm actually going to scoop here. I don't want to block any more of these.
Oh, wow.
Which really tickled me.
Oh, no.
But that's what the card's for.
Yeah.
And that's actually...
It makes sense. Yeah, no, just like, it makes sense that's like, it just extracts so much power from like, by far one of the best value cards in your deck.
Yeah, it's like Lexi shuffling back 3 of a kinds or some of her best arrows. It's just you get to kind of go get some of your best cards. And specifically in this deck, Lumina is just so much offensive power that there are a lot of matchups where playing 3 might not get there, but playing 6 certainly will.
Exactly. Removing a win condition actually is really powerful, and I like that. Specifically for that.
Yeah.
It's really good. How about the Warmongers? Oh, sorry, I cut you off.
Sorry.
What was I going to say? And you mentioned the Lexi, and that's exactly what it came to. Like during the season, when Lexi was still in there, when people were just like, okay, I'm just going to start fatiguing Lexi and trying to like prevent the damage. It's like, okay, well, then some Lexis brought in Remembrance, 2 Remembrance, and that was the strategy. So it's a very, very similar. Like, oh, if I run you out of 3 of a kinds, I win. It's like, well, not really. Anymore kind of thing. Bring us, exactly. So it's funny you mentioned it's a very, very similar strategy.
Absolutely.
That kind of streamlined approach. Now we're all Warmongers. 2 blue Warmongers, and I mean it only comes in blue, but just 2 Warmongers here. It happens to be a blue. Is this just to make sure Azalea doesn't blank you, more or less?
Yeah. This is another slot. I like this card being in the deck. This card kind of takes up a slot that I would typically spend on a little bit of Kano insulation. And I think the Kano insulation is a lot more important because I think this card is a medium amount of equity into Azalea, where having no Rune Gloves and Radiant Flow is kind of an absurd amount of equity into Kano. But I also had a pretty good idea that I wasn't going to be playing any Kanos at the PQ I took this deck to. And so I kind of just like last minute audibled in the Warmongers just in case. I didn't end up needing them either.
Sure.
I think this card is a pretty good include if you want to target Azalea and aren't that worried about Kano, because I think they often kind of take the same slot.
That's fair. I mean, there were
a choice between the 2 often.
Yeah, I mean, to your end, there were Azaleas at that PQ, so definitely you could have seen one, and this could have seen play. So I think that's pretty reasonable. As like you could put this in as like a local meta card, and just be like whatever your meta is. Like you get these slots to kind of screw around with. And see, same thing with the wind-ups. So it's really 3 slots, right? Maybe you're super heavy on Prism Hate. Add 2 more wind-ups in there, so that kind of thing, right? So I think that's definitely something. At least I take it from the viewers should probably take notice of those kinds of slots in there. So that's the list itself. We'll go through a couple of the matchups, specifically the ones you played, because I feel like you pretty much played mostly meta matchups anyways.
A lot of Bruce, a lot of Guardian.
A lot of Brute.
A lot of Brute. So much Brute.
that percentage is likely only going up. Spoiler alert. But let's talk a couple. We'll go through the matchups you played in the tournament itself, and then you can kind of talk a little bit about the sideboard you did and like kind of how it works into those matchups. So why don't you go through? I know your round one was Clay on Rhinar, right?
No, my round one opponent was Donghee on Bravo.
Oh, it was Bravo. Okay, I guess we could talk about Bravo. Bravo is still a reasonable question mark deck. I mean, he's a deck, right?
He top aided. He brought the
it's true.
He brought the deck. He did okay. How do I put it? Bravo is like one of Boltyn's best matchups by like a lot. I think if Bravo is ever a particularly popular deck, it's like almost a reason to play Boltyn. I like the first event I top aided on Boltyn. I played like several Bravos, and I was just so happy to sit down across from them every time. The Bravo drew incredibly hot. Cause like he went first, his opening was dominated Starstruck, and I was like, well, I guess I'll take 7 and like play Goblet and Spirit and pass. And he just kept drawing like that the whole game. The problem is that Boltyn's pretty good at converting his cards in a way that Bravo can't really interact with. If you want to go down to the inventory, the cards I brought in the Bravo matchup were just 3 Courageous Steel Hand, 2 Illuminate, 1 Remembrance, and 1 Celestial Cataclysm. This is the same set of cards I bring in against Victor Goldmane and also against Uzuri. They kind of have very similar ways that they end up beating Boltyn. But you kind of just like, even when he's like drawing really hot, you can kind of just like sit there and like play to get as much value out of a given hand as you possibly can. Starstruck is the only on hit that's really like a complete disaster. Chokeslam is like obnoxious, but as long as you keep your snaps, or it's a card that already has go again, like Take Flight, you can just fight through it and then like play Illumina Ascension, and suddenly the card doesn't matter. And that's another kind of way Boltyn can kind of get a little extra agency in that matchup, is by ignoring on hits like Chokeslam, and then you just burn cards like Resounding Courage or Courageous Steel Hand on Raiden instead of using them on the attack action you might have spent them on. But a lot of it is just like, you bring in your I want to kill a fatigue deck sideboard, you keep hitting them over and over until they die just at every window that they give you. You just block where you can, find the least debilitating on hits on a given turn, and then in the interim, you just try to convert your hands in the highest value way possible, like block 2 cards, you know, and then like Express Lightning Charge, that sort of thing. It's very fundamentals, flesh and blood,
right.
But you end up kind of getting there by edging Bravo out on numbers, because if he wants to block you, he bleeds a bunch of value, so a lot of the time he just can't block you. So you'll have these turn cycles where he'll be like, here's 10, and you're like, well, I'll block 3 and I'll take 7, but here's 7, and he's like, I can't block this at all.
Right.
That makes sense. So that's kind of like your board's plan into, as you said, Bravo, Victor, Uzuri. Round 2.
Round 2 was Yuki on Kayo.
I'm shocked.
Full disclosure, I think I drew a little bit like the second coming in this game. I think I had played all 3 Lumina Ascensions by turn 3.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, you did.
But her deck also drew incredibly hot, which was kind of interesting.
You two slapped each other. It was just like one of those slap. You know those competitions.
It's like a 10-minute game.
It's like the slap competitions where they're just
slap boxing.
Yeah, like it was literally. I watched it and then I looked to the other game and it was done. And I'm just like, oh, they just ran at each other. Cool.
Yeah, I think it was something like she went first. She went like Agile, Wind Up, Pass, Arsenal, Blood Rush. We go to my turn, and I go like take flight, Lumina Ascension with a resounding courage backing it up. And then it was just like that back and forth. Like she goes like Blood Rush, I go back to my turn, and I do like I had played like a Goblet, I think, something to that effect, and I had a Vigor, and it was like V Lumina, and it was just like that back and forth until one of us was dead.
Yeah, just power cards all the way. So what's your what was your sideboard into KO? I'm sure many people probably want to know this one.
Yeah, pretty reasonable question. Into KO, I present Soulbond Resolve, Balance of Justice instead of Tunic and Warband. As I mentioned earlier, it gives you 6 armor to cover up a CNC if you need a turn where you kind of need to be a little bit more belligerent. And just kind of say, like, I need this space, I'm just going to buy it with my armor, I want you to leave me alone so that I can hit you really hard. And then as far as like main deck cards, I bring in the same 3 Steel Hand package, 2 Illuminate, and then I'll actually bring in 2 Sink Belows as the last 2 cards. KO isn't going to run you out of cards, so the Remembrance isn't really a threat to him. It just doesn't really end up coming up. And then just having a few cards that can block efficiently is nice into him because he can just present such like lights out damage. Notably, you don't really ever want to bring in 3 Sink Belows because of some cards like CNC and Send Packing. They can kind of make having multiple defense reactions feel a little bit like a disaster.
Sure. And it's probably good for the filter if even if you're going more aggressive on like 3 card hands or if you have Arsenal and such. It's still quite good. Or you're looking for like a charge card. It could also be very, very good, obviously.
Yeah, the card selection is very important.
Right. So that's the KO matchup. Round 3. What did you
That
face?
was Clay on Rhinar.
That was Clay on Rhinar. All right. So what is your Rhinar sideboard? Because Rhinar is obviously getting pretty Rhinar and popular don't really make sense in the same sentence here. But what is your sideboard into Rhinar?
Into Rhinar, I take 3 Steel Hand, 3 Sink Below, and a Remembrance. The Sink Belows are good for preserving a little bit of life because I think a lot of the way Rhinar aims to win the game is by trading value back and forth with you until you're in a position where if he Blood Rushes, you just kind of pop like a grape. So sitting on cards like Sink Below in your arsenal is really effective for trying to keep your life total high. There are a lot of turn cycles where he'll like block 2 cards, go to his turn, and throw a Pack Hunt, which it's like a brutal assault, but it really discourages me from blocking. So that's where having something like Sink Below or Slap Happy in arsenal lets you preserve a little bit of life total while keeping your tempo up.
Sure.
And that's kind of the other component of that matchup is that Rhinar is pretty incentivized to block just due to the construction of his deck. He draws a lot of hands that are not really all that worth playing. So you want to keep the pressure high. You want to keep him from finding an opportunity to stabilize and start hitting you. So you kind of use 6 Lumina Ascensions, you use the Courageous Steel Hands, all these combat tricks, and the Sink Belows to just keep the pressure high, kind of keep like cranking up the amount of damage that he's going to take as your soul stacks higher and that sort of thing. And just never really let him find any breathing room. I don't play Soulbond Resolve in that matchup, but I do play Balance of Justice. I think Tunic is pretty important for setting up powerful V turns into him because he has a fair few 3-block non-attack actions in his deck. That's like basically his entire blue base outside of some Wrecker Romps. And outside of that, that's largely just I think it's mostly just how the matchup ends up playing out is you just kind of keep hitting him.
Makes sense. Okay.
Sorry, I lost my train of thought a little bit there.
No, that's okay. It's just making any additional notes. It makes sense. That's round 3. Round 4. What did you face?
3 guesses. KO.
KO.
A lot of KOs, huh?
Yeah.
This was kind of a more mid-rangey KO deck, which I was a little bit curious about how it would play. Yuki's plan into me is pretty aggressive. She's usually playing a bunch of Pulpings and Wild Rides and all that. I opted to still play the Soulbond Resolve, and in retrospect, I do think it was correct, but I was pretty back and forth on whether I might want Tunic into a more value-oriented KO list. It felt pretty similar. It felt like an exchange for having these more explosive 2-card plays where he just, like, throws an Agile Wind up for 9 or something. He was a lot worse at being able to push damage when I gave him space.
Yeah.
And I think I might have been happier into this mid-range style of KO deck than I would have been into just like full nuts on the table aggression.
Yes. That's kind of how I feel personally into that. I think if you mid-range and you break, you lose. Like into Boltyn.
Yeah.
You gotta have gas 90% of your hands, or like at least try to. But it definitely have different kind of merits. So,
it's just very difficult to play a value-oriented game plan into the hero that says that all of your 3 blocks block for 2.
Yeah, because you're into Kayo, so it's pretty much, unless you're blocking with Cast Bones or Blood Rush.
Or Blood Rush, which are not different problem to block with.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. So rolling into your next matchup, we'll just call it round 5 for all intents and purposes. Sure. We'll just call it like top 8. We'll just call the next round. So we're round 5 was against. So you're going
Bravo again.
Yeah, same Bravo. So I guess we literally talked about this exact thing already. So we're gonna skip the top 8 game. But we'll roll into the top 4 game, the semis game, because that one was
on KO again.
Oh my gosh, you're just repeating the same.
But this wasn't as much of a slapfest as the first one.
No, it was actually a pretty close game, and it's kind of actually a pretty interesting matchup. Because I think the matchup has a lot of ways it can end up playing out. You can kind of have like the games where one side high rolls are often that side. You kind of have to decide like, how does this matchup play out? Where if one side high rolls, what if they do, I don't? What if I do, they don't? What if we both high roll? And then this game was, what if we both draw some real dookie? Which is like, I go first, my hand does nothing, and I go like, well, I'm holding Goblet and Spirit, so I can do that. And I played Goblet, Spirit, Arsenal, and Pass, and then I like draw into another hand that kind of just plays Goblet. It was like, my hand was like Goblet, V charge 1, Raiden, Steel Hand, Pass. And then she was doing a lot of like drawing blues, playing like Savage Feast, Pass. Back and forth. I think these slower games tend to favor Boltyn because he wants to kind of get a little bit ahead and then start to bury you under the life gain that he gets from a lot of his power turns, or have the space to set up a more explosive turn.
Yeah.
And that kind of ended up happening, which was somewhere around Goblet number 3. I went into my next turn with Agility Vigor, and I was like, well, I have Spirit on board. I have Illumina Ascension, so I'm just going to, like, V charge everything in my hand except the Lumina Ascension. Your Flesh Bag doesn't do anything. We're both at 30, but I'm going to hit you really, really, really hard here.
Yeah, makes sense. Just, like, getting around that Flesh Bag, really quite powerful, obviously.
Yeah, having the breathing room to set up is just very smothering in that matchup.
Yeah.
That's fair. We're gonna skip the finals because it seemed to be like you just playing the same people because they happen to just keep winning their side of the brackets. You ended up
it was pretty funny.
Play again on Rhinar, but there was also May on there was Katsu also in the top 4 that you could have ended up. Okay, so it's not like there weren't any other there were other heroes at this event.
It was not a 5-person PQ, even though it sounds like it. It was just kind of like a very funny gem roulette where I think a lot of the best people in the room played each other early and then kind of kept playing each other.
Yeah, it was interesting. So let's talk about a couple of the other quote unquote meta matchups that people might be wanting to know what the sideboard plan is into. I think we can start with Katsu because you almost played against a Katsu, right? So let's start about your Katsu plan. What does that look like?
The Katsu plan. This is actually a matchup that I would want the extra Fate for Scene in the deck for. Into Katsu, I will often bring in like with this plan, I would bring in like 3 Sink Below, 1 Oath of Steel, just because it blocks 3. You may also want a Celestial Cataclysm in that spot. Both are perfectly acceptable. And then the Illuminates, because you kind of try to when you're setting up to combo first cycle, you just want to like arsenal a combo piece, block as much as you can until you find the second combo piece, and then just go off. You present like Saber Hot Streak. Hot Streak is particularly disgusting in the Katsu matchup because he can't really shut it down ever. Notably, Hot Streak says it gains go again until the end of the turn, so when you have 3 swings with it, and if they block it, it gets go again forever. It's not very fair. Into Katsu, you may also want to present Refraction Bolters, just because you can create this really unfair option select situation where if he blocks Hot Streak, you get go again forever, but if you let the sword hit, you flip 2 cards into Soul, and then you crack your Bolters, and it gets go again. So he can't really stop you once you find it. It's a matchup where you're really just trying to find, like... It doesn't have to be some crazy perfect, like, 55 damage combo. You can just play for, like, I found 2 Luminas, I'm gonna crack Gallantry, and I'm gonna present 30, and I'm probably only gonna get, like, 20-something through, but it's just gonna put you so far behind and me so high on life that the end game from here is really impossible for you. So you'll often bring in, like 3 Sink Below, 2 Illuminate, and then, like, maybe Oath of Steel Cataclysm or something like that. Warmongers is fine because it blocks. Just, you want to block. Your cards block, you need to block with them, and you're going to do a bunch of blocking into Katsu.
How much room, actually, do we have in the main board? We have 50
you want to bring in
cards. 7. Okay, 7. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. Dori. Historically, not a great matchup for Boltyn.
It's true.
I guess we can talk about the Axe story, since that's kind of all the rage. Overtaking Dawnblade and Decimator Great Axe is probably the more likely version you're going to see. So what's your plan into assuming Axe Dori? Assuming Hatchet Dori.
Small axes, not the big axe.
Small, one hand Axe Dori.
This is going to sound counterintuitive with the way that deck plays, but I actually take Raiden into that matchup. A lot of it is that their deck is so focused on extracting as much value out of a given hand that you can kind of force them to play a game of Flesh and Blood with you, as opposed to just sitting there and blocking and trying to run you out of cards, because their cards don't convert very well if they just sit there blocking, and they might not convert very well if all they do is attack. So they kind of get forced into playing this mid-range game with you, where you can get ahead by setting up big V turns to go over. Presenting a bunch of breakpoints is really frustrating for her. She doesn't do amazing at dealing with the combat tricks, and you might be surprised, but you can actually really just kind of bury her under damage by taking in your Cataclysms and your Remembrances and just pushing.
Okay. So overall, I think it definitely depends on like how much space is given on any particular hand. If Dori's allowed to like triple swing wide with Spill Blood and stuff, it gets a little awkward. But I do kind of get the idea that some of Dori's hands are also poop. So there is definitely windows for Boltyn to kind of go over with those big power cards. So I could definitely see it. The other warrior you kind of already mentioned, Kassai here. Your patented I don't know, that's not patented, but your your triple Lumina kind of combo. So why don't you kind of remind people what that sideboard looks like specifically?
Specifically into Kassai, if I'm going, like, if my goal is to execute that plan, I will take in 3 Sink Belows, the Oath of Steel, 2 Illuminate, and then another blocking card, and a lot of other iterations of the deck. As I mentioned, it's probably just extra D-reacts. And my goal is to establish the bottom 5 cards of my deck as the first 4 need to be Lumina, any blue, and any yellow. Banneret of Courage is technically optimal, but it doesn't really matter. And then the 5th card you want to either be Lumina Ascension or Oath of Steel, and then the one of those that isn't there you want to have in your arsenal. And then once you have that hand at the bottom of your deck, you just block. You make sure you move 4 cards out of your hand every single turn so that you stay on pace to draw and you can actually use your sync blows to get back on pace if you fail to convert all 4 cards in your hand. And at some point you want to charge once or twice throughout the game, and you want to have your Spirit of Irene on board. And that's all. You will get down to that hand, you will pitch blue, you will activate Warband of Bologna, you'll activate Gallantry Gold, you'll activate your Courage of Bladehold, you'll swing your first sword, you'll charge your yellow, you'll draw the 3rd Lumina, you'll drop them on the table, and then you'll draw the 3rd Lumina and drop it if you've already played the Oath of Steel, or you'll draw the Oath of Steel and play it. Technically playing Oath of Steel out of Arsenal first is optimal, but sometimes that's not really how the deck lines up. And when you set the combo up like that, it's 68 damage, which no deck in the entire game can survive. Their hand could be 5D reacts, and they could have their full 7 fridge, and they're still dead. Technically, you can be really funny. This is why I said Banneret of Courage is technically optimal. It's 69 damage.
Nice.
I knew where you were going there. So it's
optimal.
It's more optimal. It's more optimal. Okay. So...
Yeah, you only really get to do that into the decks that don't have an answer to you dropping your whole hand on the table every turn, which I think there are a few decks in the game that are like that right now. Dawnblade Dorinthia is very much like, oh, you're gonna fatigue yourself. Sweet, I'll just let you do this. Kassai is often pretty happy to let you fatigue yourself, especially stuff like the Matthew Dokes list. She has a couple outs in the form of like Raisin Army is pretty frustrating for the deck. That's something you may find yourself having to deal with, is like if they raise an army, the clock gets a lot faster. You may find yourself having to take a little bit of damage so that you can saber those tokens off, but it's certainly by no means unwinnable if they can set that up. But once you can kind of get down to that combo, the game is usually pretty much over as long as you have the life to take it. So you want to stay in like the 18 to 20 range. Just block a lot. Just block a lot. All you do is block. It's not very exciting, but it does win the game.
Well, I mean, winning is exciting. So I'd argue that's exciting either way. But no, it's a good point. Okay, there's 2 more.
Okay,
we're gonna ask you for 2 more. Prism.
Sure.
You talked a little bit about what cards you're pulling in, like the Wind Up and the Cataclysm, but why don't you also talk about, you can tell us the rest of those cards, and you can kind of tell us the game plan into Prism. There was Prism, obviously. You didn't see any Prism, but there is going to be Prism in other BQs, so, useful information.
Yeah, the Prism matchup is also one of Boltyn's best matchups. That matchup is very frustrating for Prism. She doesn't really have all that much agency. Her deck doesn't block very well, and then the cards in her deck that do block very well are attack actions, so they don't block very well. So she's kind of trying to stay alive at all costs, which is very hard for her. What I bring in this case with this particular list is Agile Wind-Up, Celestial Cataclysm, 3 Courageous Steelhand, and 2 Illuminate. You just forgo the defense reactions and just make a point to hit her very hard. 7s are really frustrating for her because sometimes she'll kind of try to keep cards and take a bunch of damage and throw a Herald, and then you're just like, no, go away. And Spirit of Irina makes it impossible for her to establish any sort of ALS-focused defense against you. Especially because charging is a cost, so you can throw a charger into their Arclight Sentinel, and then play Lumina Ascension, and it's online, and then you're just like, okay, nice one, dummy. 4/4. And it's very, very hard for Prism to find any ground in that matchup.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, that I've definitely heard that kind of echoed as being one of Prism's not favored matchups.
Right.
He's not happy to see it.
Exactly. Last one is Azalea, as I think definitely a very strong hero. Can obviously brick, but still a very strong hero that can do pretty unfair things a lot of the time. So what is your plan / board into Azalea?
So the Azalea matchup might seem hard because Boltyn is traditionally a pretty aggressive deck and Azalea is traditionally pretty good into aggressive decks. But I think it's a little bit like Azalea's Fi matchup, where I think if you ask most Azalea players what they think of the Fi matchup, they're actually going to tell you it's pretty close. Because the moment you don't really have that much disruption, he's going to hit you really hard. Which is how Boltyn ends up playing the matchup too. Except Boltyn also kind of has the advantage that his whole deck blocks pretty well. So you can kind of just like block and bide your time when and where you feel you're allowed to. I play 3 Sink Below, 2 Illuminate, 2 Courageous Steel Hand. And then in this particular iteration of the deck, I would swap the Illuminates for Warmonger's Diplomacies. Because that card just flips the game on its head into her. It's so disgustingly powerful. Excuse me. And a lot of it is just like biding your time, finding your moment to where you are not under the effect of any arrow that might kind of ruin your turn. And you just like play your Lumina Ascensions out. The Steel Hands help you, and Resounding Courages help you kind of convert your hand without being able to play multiple actions. Your cards block pretty well, and you can just kind of trade upwards on value into her and keep it close so that the moment she doesn't have what she needs, you can just kill her.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that kind of tracks. I mean, most of your stuff blocks for 3. You just send like you're blocking 12 on a lot of turns on the max. They're not really them doing above that is pretty rare in general, and if they do, they can only do it a couple times. So yeah, I definitely can see that. Also being close, I definitely would echo that statement.
Yeah. I think we may have talked about it a little bit. Maybe the Victor matchup, is it the same as Bravo, basically? Like, same sideboard?
Yeah, Victor can be a little frustrating for some people. You take the same set of cards in. I take 3 Steel Hand, 2 Illuminate, 1 Cataclysm, 1 Remembrance. That matchup can be frustrating for some people because Victor kind of generates so much value with his clashes. He has a fair few cards in his deck that aren't going to turn on your text box. And it is kind of like a harder version of the Bravo matchup, but I think it's still pretty Boltyn favored. I think the way you lose that matchup is often by Victor just kind of having it every turn, you know, like he kind of rolls Spinal Pummel, CNC Pummel, Spinal Pummel, and those feel like the games where it's like, oh, well, I guess I'm dead.
Yeah.
But you're really playing towards setting up, like, Goblet into V of the Vanguard in that matchup and just kind of, like, really smother him with, like, this big, powerful setup turn that he can't do all that much about. It's another kind of play 6 Luminas and all your problems will go away matchup.
Nice.
But you're really trying to kind of set up, like, V, maybe V and a Lumina, that sort of thing.
Sure. Okay. I think that's it as far as like kind of others. I'm not going to talk about every single matchup here. So I think we've covered like the vast majority of the ones that people are more likely to see. The last kind of question we have is mainly like post this list. What did you kind of find you would make improvement wise? Maybe cards that didn't pan out as well, or cards that you are interested in changing for different metas or different lists, however you want to frame it.
I think largely it was the 3 cards I've kind of mentioned being like, you could probably fix these on your own, as I would put the Red Agile lineup and the 2 Warmongers. I think it's largely tech for matchups that Boltyn doesn't need all that much help in. I think he's pretty 50-50 into Azalea, which is perfectly fine. I think his Prism matchup is already quite favored, and those cards can kind of be space for you to have things, like I stated, like into Kayo, you can kind of have a little bit more armor for that matchup. And there are kind of a few things that you could stand to have in the deck, like a D-React or 2. But ultimately, I'm quite happy with how the 80 has landed. We'll obviously see where things go. Not to date the video, but they announced Armory deck Boltyn today, and I'm pretty insanely excited about a few cards in that set. Those will probably be the first things that I end up replacing things here, unless there's an expansion slot card for us in Mistvale. But overall, I think I'm pretty happy with the 80.
Awesome.
Yeah. It's definitely a fun deck. I would say that reps are definitely much warranted.
Needed.
It's not.
He's a lot harder than he looks.
He's not. I think the best comparison is like Fi. I think you could pick up Fi really quickly and find like 75 to 80% efficiency lines pretty easily. Whereas I don't think that's the case for Boltyn. I think you need some. Not a million reps here, but to find the because you have an extra resource to keep track of in way of soul, it's having like that third eye and determining like when's a good like how much soul do I need before this? Like,
yeah.
how do I maximize damage versus blah 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 blah. All that kind of thing you kind of talked about in different matchups, and I think that's definitely more rewarding, especially when you win with that specific matchup knowledge as compared to like Bird. Look at me go! I'm KO and or Phi. But,
yeah, I think he's deep, and I think it's kind of something that both puts people off the deck and is a very like attractive and rewarding aspect of him. But a lot of it is that I think he does things that don't necessarily directly easily map to like a value-oriented framework when it comes to approaching the game. He does a lot of things that are patently underrated, but are still also very powerful.
Sure.
And I think that that's occasionally like a difficult thing to wrap your head around, especially as like somebody newer to the game.
Especially if you're losing games, it'll always feel bad when you lose. I think you're always playing cards that seem to not be doing much, and you're like, they're doing more than I am, so how do I win this game kind of thing.
Yeah.
And you just gotta get discouraged and switch to something else eventually.
Boltyn is very much a hero where I think as long as you can kind of like try to learn from the mistakes and losses that you experience and try to give yourself like just be patient with yourself, really give yourself the time to like look over all of your lines. I know it sounds patronizing, but I really mean it. It's just like really study every hand, because like I'm still finding new stuff with the hero, like new lines, new routes, etc., new interactions, and it's just like you really just gotta like sit there, kind of stare at everything in your hand and be like, what can I really do with all of this?
Any kind of last last kind of things you want to say? Shout outs, I don't know, whatever you want to say.
Nothing in particular is on my mind today. I've been packing. I'm pretty tired. So.
Oh, that's fair. I mean, we appreciate your time. Obviously, you're
for sure
in your schedule here. If you wanna, because you wrote that article, right?
Yeah.
Yes. I intend to have another one coming soon. I have a few things I'm pretty excited about.
Okay, so we will link that article in the description for anyone who's watching and wants to get a little bit more deep or is maybe interested after watching the video. You want to get a little bit more, a little more invested, a little more information, some details, stuff like that. This list also, if you are looking, this list will be in Fabry, but if you want to see on FabTCG, it's also there. If that's your preferred method for looking at lists for whatever reason,
the metagame minute.
You can look at this week. No, you could look at the deck list. It's hard to get on that deck list description there in the little Fab icon. So it's also on there. And for that, if you like this kind of content, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And for wherever you're watching in the world, have a good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Bye for now.